On the morning of August 6, 1945, at 08 hours 15 minutes, the sun rose twice in Hiroshima. The first time in the east, the second time in the very center of the sky. That second sun brought with it a horror never before seen on Earth and instantly destroyed 80,000 people. If you had been someone walking the streets of Hiroshima that morning, you would have been right in the middle of one of the darkest moments in human history. So what would you have done if you were there? Before we begin the video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share in the comments which country you're watching from. So let's go to Hiroshima, to the morning of August 6, 1945. Chapter 1. The last normal morning when you opened your eyes. The inside of the room was filled with dim light. August 6th, 1945. Monday morning. The sun hadn't fully risen yet in Hiroshima, but the city was beginning to wake. You pushed aside the thin blanket beside you and sat up. When the cool texture of the tatami floor touched your feet, it made you feel the day had begun. This morning didn't seem different from other mornings, but it was actually the last normal morning of your life. From the wooden walls of your house came sounds of your mother moving in the kitchen. She was preparing miso soup for breakfast, cooking rice. Your father's cough was heard from the corridor. It was the 4th year of the war and everyone was tired. Hiroshima was a city that had escaped major bombings. But this situation didn't comfort anyone. On the contrary, there was a strange expectation inside people. Tokyo had burned. Osaka had burned. Nagoya had burned. Almost all major Japanese cities had been targets of American B-29 bomber aircraft. That Hiroshima still stood wasn't a miracle, just that its time hadn't come yet. You went to the kitchen to wash. When your mother looked at you, there was fatigue in her eyes, but she still smiled. "Good morning," she said quietly, and placed a bowl of miso soup in front of you. The soup was hot, and when its steam hit your face, it made you feel the reality of the day. Rice was scarce. There was no meat. Vegetables were very few. But you were still grateful. Many families were eating even less than this. The war had taken something from everyone's table, and what remained was only enough to survive. Your sibling was still sleeping, 8 years old, and schools were on summer vacation. But even children weren't idle. Buildings were being demolished to help with firefighting efforts in the city. Empty spaces were being created to prevent fire from spreading when American planes came. This morning, your sibling would also take duty in one of those teams. Your mother went to the room to wake him, and a few minutes later, he came to the kitchen with sleepy eyes. "Big brother," he said, and sat next to you. You stroked his head, and he was also given soup. Breakfast passed silently. News was being read on the radio. The Japanese army's advance in China, the situation of islands in the Pacific, victory announcements. But everyone knew the truth. Japan was losing. The American Navy had now come right up to Japanese waters. Cities were being bombed one by one. But still, surrender was out of the question. Dying for the emperor was an honor, and everyone was forced to believe this. After breakfast, you prepared to go to work. You were 19 years old and worked as a clerk at a bank in the city center. In normal times, you would have gone to university. But the war had changed everything. Young men were being sent to the front, and you would be conscripted after a while. But for now, you organized documents in the bank's archives section, helped customers, and returned home tired every evening. After putting on your white shirt, you pulled on your trousers and looked at yourself in a small mirror. Your hair was neat, your face tired. For the last few days, you hadn't been sleeping properly at night. Air raid sirens were going off almost every night. American planes were passing over Hiroshima but leaving without dropping bombs. This situation made people even more anxious. Why weren't they attacking Hiroshima? No one knew the answer to this question, but everyone was making assumptions. Maybe the city was too small. Maybe it had no strategic importance. Or maybe it was being saved for something bigger. Before leaving home, your mother gave you a small bundle. Inside were rice balls for lunch. "Be careful," she said, and kissed your forehead. Your father's hand rested on your shoulder. "Come home right away," he said sternly, but there was worry in his eyes. Your sibling also came to the door and said, "See you later, big brother." This seemed like an ordinary farewell, but it was actually the last family moment of your life. When you went out into the street, the sun had fully risen. Hiroshima in the early morning hours was a calm city. The streets were narrow, the houses wooden and low. You walked toward the city center, passing along the edge of the Motoyasu River. The river flowed still and sunlight sparkled on its surface. A few fishing boats were swaying on the water. Children were going to school. Women were heading to the market. Elderly people were sitting in front of their houses. Everyone was continuing their routine. As you walked, you looked at the sky. It was a clear blue, cloudless sky. The August heat hadn't started yet, but you felt the air would get heavy. Hiroshima's summers were very hot, and this year wouldn't be different. But now it wasn't heat, it was silence that caught your attention. The city was very calm. Despite it being the beginning of the week, there was no traffic, no military vehicles, no sound of aircraft. When you approached the bank, the time was showing nearly 0800 hours. The building was in the central district of the city and was a 3-story white structure. At the entrance, the security guard recognized you and greeted with his head. You climbed the stairs to the second floor and sat at your desk. Papers were piled on the desk. Loan applications, account records, letters. You would examine and organize each one. This was an ordinary job, but having a job in wartime was even a luxury. You spent the first half hour reviewing files. Your colleagues also started arriving. Morning greetings, plans for the day, small talk. Everyone was busy, but at the same time, everyone was distracted. It was being discussed that the war was about to end. Military shipments from Hiroshima port had decreased. Even the military headquarters located in the center wasn't as active as before. Whether Japan would surrender was a topic of debate, but no one was openly voicing this. Around 08 hours, 10 minutes, you took a break and walked to the window. When you looked outside, you could see the entire city. Hiroshima was a flat city built on the delta of the Ota River, consisting of 7 branches. Buildings were generally low and wooden. There were only a few concrete structures. In the distance, you could see the Aoid Bridge. This T-shaped bridge was the symbol of the city and connected 2 branches of the river. Trams were passing over the bridge and people were going to work. Suddenly, you heard a plane sound in the distance. You raised your head and looked at the sky. High up, among the clouds, there was a shining metal body. A B-29 bomber. American planes were now flying comfortably in Japanese airspace. Fighter plane intervention was almost non-existent. The plane was advancing from west to east and seemed like it would pass over Hiroshima. The air raid alarm didn't sound. This was a strange situation because when an enemy plane came, the alarm would definitely sound. But this morning there was no alarm, and no one was panicking. You continued watching the plane. It was slowly coming over the city. The roar of its engines was like a faint buzz. One of your colleagues came to you and said, "They're doing a reconnaissance flight again." This had been happening frequently in recent days. American planes were coming, taking photos of the city. and leaving. They weren't dropping bombs. That's why even the alarm wasn't sounding. People had gotten used to it, and no longer paid much attention to planes in the sky. But you continued watching anyway. When the plane was right over the city, you noticed something. A small dot fell from under the plane. At first, you couldn't understand what it was. Maybe it was a research device, maybe a camera, or maybe just an object. But that falling object would change the world forever. The time was approaching 0, 8 hours, 15 minutes, and Hiroshima's last normal moments were ending. As that small dot in the sky fell toward the ground, you were still about to return to your desk. You had no idea about anything, and in a few seconds, everything would end. Chapter 2. The sun descended to Earth. When you turned from the window, you were about to sit at your desk. It was a few seconds past 0, 8 hours, 15 minutes. That small dot in the sky was still falling, but you were no longer seeing it. You reached for one of the files and started examining it. Your colleagues were also busy with their own work. The clicks in the bank, paper rustles, and footsteps were the sounds of a normal Monday morning. No one had any suspicion of a disaster in their mind, and everyone was continuing their routine. Suddenly, the entire world was enveloped in white light. At first, you couldn't understand what it was because your eyes had gone so blind they couldn't perceive the light. It was as if the sun had entered through the window and exploded in the middle of the room. This light wasn't ordinary light. It was white, brilliant, and burning. It was as if thousands of suns had suddenly started burning in the sky. You closed your eyes, but the light was passing even through your eyelids. Everything had disappeared, and only that terrible whiteness remained. At that moment you felt time had stopped. You didn't know whether a second or a minute had passed, while your brain was trying to understand what was happening. Your body had frozen. Then the heat came. First a slight warmth, then an unbearable burning. On your face, hands, everywhere on your body, there was a terrible burning sensation. You sweated as if you had entered an oven and felt a fire boiling from under your skin. This heat wasn't natural. It was even more powerful than the heat of the sun, and was instantly burning and scorching everything. Then came the sound, but this wasn't sound. It was the shockwave. Before you heard the sound, the air hit you, as if a giant fist had struck your chest. You became unable to breathe. Window glass shattered, and thousands of glass fragments were scattered inward. Walls cracked, the ceiling collapsed, the floor shook. As you fell behind the desk, everything started raining on your head. Wooden beams, plaster pieces, glass, papers, furniture. Everything mixed together and collapsed on you. Your ears had burst. A terrible ringing sound was echoing inside your head. Sounds coming from outside were muffled and distant. You heard someone screaming, but it was as if it came from very far away. Even your own voice sounded strange. You tried to shout, but your voice didn't come out. You tried to breathe, but your chest was burning. You tried to move, but your body was trapped under weights. A few seconds later, the first shock began to pass. You opened your eyes, but everything was blurry. Dust, smoke, and debris were flying in the air. The inside of the bank had become unrecognizable. Walls had collapsed, the ceiling had fallen, and everywhere had turned into a pile of rubble. You could see the arm of your colleague sitting at the desk next to you, but the rest of his body was under the debris. He wasn't moving. Another person in front had their head trapped under a beam, and blood was slowly spreading. In panic, you started to move. You tried to push the wooden beam on you, but it was heavy. Using your hands, you dragged yourself and managed to get out from under the beam. When you stood up, your knees were trembling. When you looked around, the scene you saw was incomprehensible. The interior of the bank had completely collapsed. The floor had cracked, walls had toppled, and everywhere was filled with debris. People were trapped among the rubble. Some were moving, some were lying silently, some were shouting for help. You staggered toward the window. There was no window frame left, and you could look outside. The scene you saw was horrifying. Hiroshima was burning. Flames were rising in every direction. Buildings had collapsed. Streets were filled with debris, and people were running in the streets. The sky was covered with a red and black cloud of smoke. Even the sun had disappeared behind this smoke. In the distance, a giant mushroom-shaped cloud was rising. This cloud was so large it seemed like it would cover half the sky. It was shining with orange, red, and black colors, and was constantly growing. You tried to understand what had happened. Was it a bomb? But you had never seen such a bomb. Bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima before, but those were small explosions. This was as if the entire city had been destroyed at once. The first thought that came to mind was that many bombs might have been detonated at the same time. But this didn't make sense either. You had seen only one plane, and that plane had dropped only one thing. You started advancing toward the stairs through the debris. Every step was painful. Under your feet were glass fragments, boards, and rubble. When you reached the stairs, you saw they were also half destroyed. Steps were cracked. Railings had broken off. You carefully started descending and felt the building swaying with each step. When you descended to the first floor, the situation was even worse. The entrance hall had completely collapsed. The ceiling had come down to the floor, and sounds were coming from inside. People were trapped under the debris and were crying out for help. You headed toward the side door to get out. The door was half open, and you forced your way out. When you stepped into the street, you faced reality. Hiroshima had turned into hell. There was fire in every direction. Wooden buildings were burning in flames, and fire was jumping from one building to another. People were running in the streets. Some had burns on them. Some had lost their arms. Some had faces that had become unrecognizable. Screams, moans, and the roar of fire were mixing together. A woman passed by you. The kimono on her was completely burned, and the skin on her back had peeled off. She was staggering as she walked, and moaning, "Water, water." Behind her came a man. His arms were stretched forward, and his hands were swollen and bleeding. His eyes were looking blankly at a point ahead. Another person was crawling on the ground. His legs were broken, and he was leaving a trail of blood behind him. There were injured people in every direction, and no one could help them, because everyone was trying to save themselves. You started running toward your house. When your family came to mind, the panic increased even more. Your mother was at home. Your sibling was in the fire prevention work. Your father was also working in another part of the city. You didn't know the situation of any of them, and this uncertainty was driving you crazy. As you ran, you saw the destruction around you. The streets you knew were now unrecognizable. Buildings had collapsed, bridges had fallen, and everywhere was filled with debris. When you approached the Aoi Bridge, you saw the bridge was still standing, but the tram rails on it were bent. There were dozens of corpses on the bridge. The shockwave of the explosion had thrown people into the air, and they had crashed into the bridge. Some were moving, but most were motionless. As you crossed the bridge, you felt yourself stepping on things under your feet, but you didn't look. You couldn't look. Hundreds of people had gathered by the riverbank. They all wanted to go into the water, because their bodies were burning. Some had thrown themselves into the water and were being swept away in the current. Some were lying face down at the water's edge. The surface of the river was filled with corpses, and the water was stained with blood. It was a terrible sight, but you couldn't stop. You had to reach your house. When you reached your neighborhood, your heart started beating faster. The houses had collapsed. Wooden structures had completely collapsed, and only charred remains were left in their place. The fire was still continuing, and flames were jumping from one house to another. When you arrived at the street where your own house was, your breath caught. Your house wasn't there. There was only a burning pile of debris. The walls had collapsed, the roof had fallen, and everywhere was on fire. "Mother!" you shouted, but your voice was lost in the noise of the fire. You ran toward the debris, but the heat pushed you back. The flames were too high, and it was impossible for you to approach. "Mother, my sibling," you shouted again, but no answer came. You looked around. Your neighbors' houses were in the same state. Everywhere was burning, and no one was there. They had either died or fled. In panic, you tried to approach the debris again, but an explosion occurred, and you jumped back. Something inside the house had exploded, and the flames had risen even higher. Now it was absolutely impossible for you to enter. You collapsed to your knees and started screaming. Tears ran down your cheeks but evaporated quickly because the air was so hot. You didn't know how long you stayed there. Maybe a few minutes, maybe longer. Finally, you stood up because the fire was approaching you. The neighbor's house collapsed and flames jumped to where you were. You had to retreat. You might have lost your family, but you were still alive and had to live. You started running toward the river because water was the only safe place. Hiroshima was burning, and the only way to escape that fire was to go to the water's edge. Chapter 3. In the middle of hell. As you ran toward the river, the fire around you was growing even larger. Hiroshima's wooden houses were burning like dry wood, and fire was jumping from one neighborhood to another. The temperature had become unbearable, and with every breath, your lungs were burning. The sky had now completely darkened because giant smoke clouds had hidden the sun. Your surroundings were illuminated with a dim and crimson light, and this light gave the city a hellish appearance. As you staggered forward in the streets, you forced yourself not to look at the state of the people passing in front of you. A mother was carrying her small baby in her arms, but the baby's body had turned completely black and wasn't moving. The woman continued walking anyway and was murmuring, sleeping, just sleeping. An old man was leaning against an electric pole, and half his body was burned. He was looking at you, but couldn't speak. Only wheezing sounds came from his mouth, and his eyes were begging for help. But you couldn't help him, because you yourself were barely walking. Suddenly you noticed something strange. The wind had changed. At first, there was a gentle breeze blowing from outside the city inward. But now the wind had reversed. A strong air current had formed toward the city center, and this current was fueling the fire even more. What you didn't understand was that the fire was creating its own wind. At the center of Hiroshima, that terrible explosion had created such great heat that hot air was rising upward, and the surrounding cold air was flowing inward to fill this void. This was creating a natural firestorm, and the city was burning like a giant furnace. As the wind strengthened, walking became difficult. The flames were dancing with the wind and bending toward you. Sparks were flying in the air and falling on your shirt. Several times you had to extinguish small flames on your shirt. Your hair had scorched, and its smell was burning your nose. The skin on your hands had formed blisters, and every movement was painful. But you couldn't stop, because stopping meant dying. When you reached the bank of the Motoyasu River, the scene you saw was an image you would never forget. Thousands of people had gathered on both banks of the river. They were all at the water's edge, and most had entered the water. Their bodies were burned, and all they wanted was to cool down with the cool water. But the water itself was also no longer cool, because the heat of the surrounding fire had heated even the water. Still, people continued entering the water, because this was their only hope. You also reached the river bank and collapsed to your knees. Hundreds of people were lying at the water's edge. Some had swollen bodies. Some had skin completely peeled off. Some had eyes that had melted. But the most terrible thing was that they were still alive. They were talking, moaning, and asking for help. A man reached toward you and said, "Water, please water." His hands were trembling, and his body was shaking uncontrollably. You took some of the river water in your palms and poured it into his mouth. He took a sip, and then his head fell to the side. His eyes closed and he stopped breathing. Right next to him was another woman, and she wanted the same thing. You gave her water too, but she also died a few minutes later. When you looked around, you noticed the river water had turned red. Blood, skin pieces, and corpses were floating in the water. The river's current was slow, and everything was staying on the water's surface. Some people had completely entered the water and drowned. To escape the pain, they had let themselves go into the water and never came up again. There were children at the water's edge. Tiny bodies were lying motionless, and no one was looking at them because everyone was busy with their own pain. Suddenly, you saw movement on the opposite bank. A group of people was passing through the debris and advancing toward the river. Among them were military uniforms, and civilians too. You tried to shout toward them, but your voice didn't come out. Your throat was bone dry, and speaking was almost impossible. You waved your hands and tried to get their attention. The group noticed you and came to your side by crossing the bridge. The first to arrive was a soldier. His face was covered in soot, and his uniform was torn. "Do you need help?" he asked. You nodded and tried to say, "My family," but the words didn't come out of your mouth. The soldier understood you and asked, "Where did you live?" You pointed toward your house, but there was nothing left there anymore. There was only fire. The soldier nodded and said, "I'm sorry." Then he continued, because there were other people he could help. You started advancing with the group. They were helping the wounded, gathering survivors, and directing them to safe zones. But there were almost no safe zones, because the entire city was burning. Only a few open areas and the riverbank were relatively safer. The group advanced with you along the river, and with every step you encountered new corpses, new wounded, and new horrifying scenes. At one point, you passed by firewalls. In Hiroshima, some buildings had been demolished and empty spaces created to prevent the spread of fire. It was precisely in these areas that hundreds of people had died. People who were in the open area at the moment of the explosion had been directly exposed to the heat wave and had burned instantly. Now these areas were completely black, and the ground was covered with charred bodies. You saw that some bodies' shadows had been etched into walls. The postures of people at the moment of explosion had been engraved on the walls, and only these shadows remained. This image was so disturbing that you immediately turned your head. When you passed by a school building, you heard children's voices from inside. The building was half destroyed, but some children were still alive inside. Soldiers entered the debris and started bringing children out. You helped too. You were lifting rubble, and bringing children outside. Some children were alive, but most were dead. The living children were crying and wanting their mothers. But where were their mothers? Maybe they were also under the debris, or dying at the riverbank. Toward afternoon, the firestorm reached its peak. The wind was so strong that standing was difficult. Flames were rising hundreds of meters into the sky, and the air was completely filled with smoke. Breathing had become impossible, and you were constantly coughing. Your eyes were burning and filling with tears, but these tears weren't from pain, but from smoke. At one point, a woman who appeared before you stopped you. "Please, have you seen my son?" she asked. 10 years old, wearing a school uniform. You shook your head, but couldn't answer. How many children had you seen? Hundreds, maybe thousands. They all looked the same. Wounded, burned, dead. The woman started pleading with you, but you couldn't help her. You hadn't even found your own family. Toward evening, the fire started slowing down. There was nothing left to burn anymore, because most of the city had turned to ash. Hiroshima's center had completely disappeared. For kilometers, the area was covered only with debris, ash, and smoke. There were almost no buildings left standing. Only a few concrete structures and bridges were still standing, but they had also been damaged. The sky slowly started clearing, and stars began appearing. This was a strange moment, because while there was a peaceful night sky above, hell was still continuing below. Hundreds of people were sitting silently by the riverbank. Some were wounded, some were in shock, some were just waiting. What were they waiting for? Help? Death? No one knew. You also sat by the riverbank and put your head in your hands. Your body ached, your mind was confused, and your heart was broken. Your family was on your mind. You were thinking about your mother, your sibling, your father. Could they still be alive? Maybe your mother had managed to escape from the house. Maybe your sibling was somewhere else with the firefighting team. Maybe your father was also looking for you. But deep down, you knew the truth. Hiroshima's center had completely disappeared, and everyone who was in that area had probably died. As night progressed, a new fear began. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, and rain started falling. But this wasn't normal rain. It was black, sticky, and smelly. Black rain. The bomb's radioactive dust had risen into the atmosphere and now was falling back to Earth. With the rain, people were initially happy because the rain was extinguishing the fire and cooling. But this rain was actually poison, and no one knew this. Black rain fell on their bodies, faces, and mouths. They drank, washed, and cooled down. But at the same time, they were also taking death inside them. You also went out into the rain and turned your face to the sky. Black drops fell on your face, and at that moment you felt a strange pain inside. But from fatigue, you no longer cared. The first day in Hiroshima was ending, and what remained were only rubble, corpses, and the moans of survivors. Chapter 4. Black Rain. When the black rain slowly started stopping, your body was soaked from head to toe. Your shirt was covered with black stains, and water, dripping from your hair, was flowing onto your face. There was a strange, metallic taste in your mouth, and this taste wouldn't go away. When you rubbed your tongue against your palate, a bitter feeling spread, but you couldn't understand why. The people around were also soaking wet in the same way, and no one knew what this rain was. Some thought this rain would extinguish the fire and were happy, but most were just sitting silently, because there was nothing left to be happy about. The crowd by the riverbank was increasing even more as night progressed. People continued coming from every direction, and they were all looking for the same thing: water, safety, and perhaps loved ones who had miraculously survived. You also continued looking for your family around. You examined every new arriving group, looked at every face, and waited with hope of seeing someone familiar. But as hours passed, this hope was diminishing, because most of the coming people were unrecognizable. Their faces were burned, their hair had fallen out, and their eyes were looking ahead blankly from shock. At one point, an old man came to you and sat next to you. The man's right arm was missing, and blood was oozing from his shoulder. Still, he sat silently and looked at the river. "It was a beautiful city," he said in a hoarse voice. "Hiroshima was a very beautiful city." You nodded, but couldn't speak. The man continued. "I lived here for 50 years. I got married, had children, had grandchildren. They were all in this city. Now they're all gone." Tears ran from his eyes, and he started crying silently. You also wanted to cry, but your tears weren't coming. It was as if there was no moisture left in your body and you could no longer cry. In the late hours of the night, you started hearing strange sounds around. They weren't human sounds. They were like ghost sounds. Whispers, wheezes, and muffled screams were coming from every direction. Some people were delirious. They were talking to people who didn't exist, pointing to things you couldn't see, and making meaningless sentences. A woman kept repeating, "I have to go home, I have to go home." But her home no longer existed. A child was calling for his mother, but there was no answer because his mother was probably dead. These sounds echoed in the silence of the night, and each sound broke your heart a bit more. Toward morning, when the first lights appeared in the sky, you dared to look around. Things you didn't see in the darkness of night were now emerging in daylight. The riverbank was filled with corpses. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people had died throughout the night and were now lying motionless. Some were in the water, some were on the shore, some were piled on top of each other. The smell was unbearable. Burned flesh, blood, and decay smells had mixed together and poisoned the air. Your stomach churned and you wanted to vomit, but there was nothing left in your stomach. When you stood up, your head spun and you lost your balance and fell to the ground. Your body wasn't as strong as before, and every movement was becoming difficult. When you looked at your arms, you noticed your skin was covered with red spots. These were burns from yesterday, but now they looked worse. Your skin was filled with blisters, and some places were bleeding. Your hands were trembling and shaking uncontrollably. Was this just from fear, or was something else happening? You didn't know. When you looked at the people around, you noticed they were showing similar symptoms. Many people's hair had started falling out. There were tufts of hair on the ground, and some people's heads had completely gone bald. Some people's gums had started bleeding, and blood was coming from their mouths. Some had purple spots forming on their bodies, and these spots were gradually growing. These weren't normal burn symptoms. Something else was happening, but no one knew what. As morning progressed, the city's condition started becoming clearer. Hiroshima had completely disappeared. Within an area of about 2 kilometers from the city center, almost no building remained standing. Everything had been flattened. Only a few concrete skeletons and wall remnants were standing. The most striking was the building known as Genbaku Dome. The former Hiroshima Chamber of Commerce and Industry building was very close to the explosion center, but still part of its dome had remained standing. The lines of its steel skeleton extended to the sky, and this scene was both eerie and pitiful. You started walking along the river because you had to go somewhere. Just sitting would drive you crazy. As you took steps, you were being careful not to step on corpses. But this was almost impossible, because everywhere was filled with corpses. Some corpses were so burned that it was even difficult to understand they were human. Charred bodies, twisted arms, and open mouths were as if trying to say something with their last breaths. You saw a group of soldiers. There was a large military garrison in Hiroshima, and some soldiers were still on duty. You ran toward them and asked for help. "Is there food? Is there water?" you asked. One of the soldiers shook his head. "There's nothing. Everything is gone. But help will come from outside the city. Be patient." These words weren't very convincing, because if help was really coming, why hadn't it arrived yet? The explosion had been since yesterday, and more than 24 hours had passed. The truth was, people outside Hiroshima didn't know exactly what had happened in the city. Communication lines were cut, roads were unusable, and reaching the city was almost impossible. A few reconnaissance teams had come and seen the horror, but aid teams hadn't been organized yet. That's why those remaining in Hiroshima were trying to survive on their own. Toward noon, the sun rose in the sky and temperature increased. It was mid-August, and summer heat in Japan was unbearable. But now the temperature was even worse, because the fires in the city still hadn't completely gone out. In some areas, embers were still burning, and air temperature was exceeding almost 40 degrees. People were fainting from the heat. Finding water was critical, but there was almost no clean water. River water might have been contaminated with radioactive dust, but no one knew this. People were still drinking water from the river and taking more radiation into their bodies. You also couldn't endure and drank water from the river. The water you took in your palms was murky and had a strange taste, but you didn't care. Thirst was so intense that you would drink anything. As you sipped the water, you felt your stomach relax. But nausea also started coming. A few minutes later, you started vomiting and expelled everything in your stomach. But there was nothing in your stomach. Only water and bile were coming. In the afternoon, a group of civilian volunteers came. These people, coming from neighboring cities, had come to help. The supplies they brought were very limited. A few bottles of water, some rice balls, and some basic medical supplies. But even this was a miracle for Hiroshima. People got in line for food and water. You also joined the line and waited for hours. When your turn came, you were given a rice ball and a glass of water. When you put the rice ball in your mouth, it was so hard and dry that swallowing was difficult. But you still chewed and swallowed because this was the first thing you had eaten in days. One of the volunteers was looking at the wounded. You approached him and showed the burns on your arms. The man examined your wounds and shook his head. Serious burns. There's risk of infection, but there's not much I can do. No medicine, no bandages. Then he pulled a small box from his pocket and took out some kind of ointment. "I can apply this much," he said, and applied the ointment on your wounds. The ointment was cool and eased the pain a bit, but it wasn't enough. Toward evening, a new wave of sick people arrived. These were people who had been in the outer districts of the city at the time of the explosion. They hadn't been directly exposed to the heat wave and hadn't been trapped under buildings, but now they were getting sick. They were vomiting. Their hair was falling out, and spots were appearing on their bodies. These people were showing the first symptoms of radiation sickness, but at that time, no one knew the word radiation. People started calling this atomic sickness, but no one understood what it really was. A doctor came. He had come from a hospital outside the city and wanted to see what had happened in Hiroshima. He examined the patients and was astonished. "I've never seen these symptoms," he said. Different from normal burns. Internal bleeding, hair loss, rapid cell death. This is a new type of disease. The doctor took notes, examined patients, but couldn't treat them because there was no treatment. There was no known medicine against radiation sickness at that time, and people were just waiting and dying. When night fell again, the second night in Hiroshima was beginning. The city was still silent, but now the fires had gone out. Only smoke and ash remained. Stars were shining in the sky, and the moon had risen. The contrast between this calm night sky and the hell below was incomprehensible. How could there be so much peace above while there was so much suffering below? You also lay down, somewhere by the riverbank. Your body was so tired that you could no longer move. You put a stone next to you and leaned your head on it. When you closed your eyes, you saw your family's faces. Your mother was smiling while making soup in the mornings. Your sibling was running when returning from school. Your father was looking tired but happy when he came home in the evening. Now they were all gone, and only memories remained. Tears ran down your cheeks. This time you could cry. You cried silently, and no one heard you, because everyone around was busy with their own pain. The second night in Hiroshima passed like this, crying, suffering, and knowing death was waiting at the door. When morning came, you noticed some people were no longer waking up. There were those who had died throughout the night, and corpses continued multiplying. Hiroshima was turning into a mass grave, and no one had the strength to bury these dead. Corpses started rotting under the sun, and the smell became unbearable. When the third day came, some aid teams finally managed to reach the city. Military trucks, doctors, and nurses came. They started gathering the wounded and transporting them to temporary hospitals outside the city. You were also included in this evacuation list. They put you on a truck and moved away from Hiroshima. As you looked back from the truck, you saw your city for the last time. Hiroshima was no longer a city. It was only piles of rubble, ash, and death. The place where you had spent 19 years of your life no longer existed, and you would never be the same person again. Chapter 5. A world forever changed. As the truck moved away from Hiroshima, you kept turning back to look. A giant smoke cloud still hung over the city, and this cloud covered a large part of the sky. The sun appeared from behind this smoke as a pale and crimson light. In the back of the truck with you were about 20 more wounded. Some were sitting silently, some were moaning, some were unconscious. Everyone's body was burned, cut, and bleeding. Most had empty eyes, and it was as if their souls had left their bodies. The truck arrived at the temporary hospital in the neighboring city after about an hour. This was actually a school building, but now it was hosting hundreds of wounded. Classrooms had been transformed into hospital wards. Corridors were filled with stretchers, and in every corner doctors were attending to patients. When they brought you down from the truck, your legs didn't hold and you collapsed to the ground. 2 nurses lifted you and carried you inside. You were taken to a classroom and laid down on a bedding spread on the floor. When you looked around, wounded were lying everywhere in the classroom. Some had bodies wrapped in bandages, some had open, untreated wounds. A doctor came to you and started examining you. He looked at the burns on your arms, checked your pulse, and examined your eyes. "You're showing radiation symptoms," he said quietly. "Hair loss, internal bleeding, low blood cell count. There's not much we can do, but we'll try to make you comfortable." These words frightened you, because "there's not much we can do" meant a death sentence. The hopelessness in the doctor's eyes said everything. Modern medicine had become completely helpless in the face of this new disease. As days passed, your condition started worsening. Your hair continued falling out in large clumps, and within a week, your head was almost completely bald. Your gums started bleeding, and your pillow was covered in blood in the mornings. Purple and blue spots appeared all over your body, and these spots gradually grew. Your fever was constantly high, and you were shivering at night while soaking in sweat during the day. Your appetite completely disappeared, and you vomited everything you ate. Your body rapidly thinned, and your bones started showing through your skin. Deaths were happening in the hospital every day. The man staying in the bed next to you died on the third day. When you woke in the morning, his face was purple, and he wasn't breathing. Nurses came, took the body, and brought a new patient in his place. This cycle constantly repeated. Incoming patients stayed for a few days and then died. Some lasted longer, but the result was always the same. Most who caught radiation sickness were dying, and these deaths were slow and painful. One day, another Hiroshima survivor came to you. His name was Tanaka, and like you, he was in the city center at the time of explosion. You told each other your stories. He had also lost his family. His wife and 2 children had died at the moment of explosion. You know, Tanaka said. We had argued at breakfast that morning. My wife wanted more rice, but I had gotten angry with her because rice was scarce. Now, whenever I think about that argument, I hate myself. Our last moments passed with an argument. Tears ran from his eyes, and you shared his pain because you were experiencing similar regrets. Radio news was constantly playing in the hospital. When you learned on August 9th that a new bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki, you were shocked. It was as if Hiroshima wasn't enough, and a second atomic bomb had been dropped on Japan. Tens of thousands of people had also died in Nagasaki, and the city had turned to ruins. This news horrified everyone in the hospital, because now it was clear these bombs weren't special. The Americans had more, and if they wanted, they could destroy all of Japan. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke on the radio. Japan was surrendering. The war was over. People in the hospital received this news in different ways. Some cried, some stayed silent, some were relieved because there would be no more deaths. When you heard this news, you felt a strange emptiness inside. Japan had been defeated, and millions of people had died in vain. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been the price of this defeat. But at least now the war was over, and perhaps, in the future, it could be rebuilt. As weeks passed, some patients started recovering. You were one of them. You had survived the worst period of radiation sickness, and your body was slowly starting to recover. Your fever dropped, vomiting decreased, and you gathered some strength. Doctors called this a miracle, because most patients coming from Hiroshima were dying. Your survival was a statistically low probability, but you had somehow managed. In September, you recovered enough to leave the hospital. Your body was still weak. Your hair hadn't grown back yet, and your skin was covered with spots, but you could walk and talk. When you left the hospital, you didn't know where to go. You had no home, no family, and didn't want to return to Hiroshima. Finally, you decided to go to a distant relative's house. Your uncle lived in the rural area of the city and hadn't been much affected by the war. He accepted you into his home, and you started staying there. You spent quiet days at your uncle's house. You helped with field work, planted rice, and harvested. It was a simple life, but it kept you alive. At night, you had nightmares. You relived that morning in Hiroshima over and over. You saw the white light, felt the fire, and heard your family's screams. You woke from sleep screaming and stayed soaked in sweat. These nightmares would continue for years and perhaps never end. As months passed, news about the situation in Hiroshima kept coming. The city had completely turned to ruins, and reconstruction work hadn't started yet. Radiation levels were still high, and entering the city center was dangerous. The death toll wasn't known for certain, but estimates ranged between 80,000 and 140,000. This number didn't only include those who died at the moment of explosion. It also covered those who died from radiation sickness in the following weeks and months. It was said the true death toll would never be known because many people had completely vaporized or become unrecognizable. In early 1946, you decided to return to Hiroshima. You wanted to see maybe a miracle had happened, and your family had survived. Maybe part of your house was still standing. These hopes weren't realistic, but you still had to go. You got on the train and set off toward Hiroshima. As the train approached the city, you looked out the window, and the scene you saw broke your heart. Hiroshima was still in ruins. 6 months had passed, but the city was still like a cemetery. Buildings were still collapsed, streets were still filled with debris, and everything was ash-colored. Only a few temporary huts and barracks had been built. Even the train station was destroyed, and a temporary platform had been set up. When you got off the train, you expected to see a familiar place. But everything was foreign. Hiroshima was no longer the city you knew. You walked to where your old house used to be. Along the way, the people you encountered looked like ghosts. They were walking with thin, tired, and hopeless faces. Many had bandages on them, and some still had falling hair. People remaining in Hiroshima were still experiencing the effects of radiation, and many were getting sick. When you arrived where your house used to be, you saw only a flat area. Not even debris remained. Everything had been cleaned, and only black stains remained. You collapsed to the ground and touched the soil. This soil contained your family's ashes. Your mother, your sibling, and maybe your father were lying somewhere here. You started crying and stayed there for a long time. No one bothered you, because in Hiroshima everyone was mourning something. Toward evening, you went to the Iowa Bridge. The bridge was still standing, but damaged. You stood on the bridge and looked at the river. Debris pieces were still floating in the water. A monument stone had been erected on the riverbank. On the stone was written, "Pray for those who died in Hiroshima." In the distance, the Genbaku Dome was visible. Its dome was still standing, and its steel skeleton extended to the sky. This building would become the symbol of Hiroshima. It would stand forever as a monument reminding of the atomic bomb's horror. That evening, you stayed in a shelter in Hiroshima. The next day, you left the city and never returned. Hiroshima was the past, and you had to look to the future. But Hiroshima never left you. You thought about it every day, remembered it every night, and lived the rest of your life in the shadow of that morning. Years passed. Japan was rebuilt and experienced an economic miracle. Hiroshima was also rebuilt and became a modern city. But the Peace Park in the city center always stood there. The Genbaku Dome was preserved and added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. Every year on August 6th, a memorial ceremony was held in Hiroshima, and the world remembered that day. You also continued your life. You married, had children, and grew old. But Hiroshima never left you. The effects of radiation on your body showed themselves even years later. Cancer risk was high, and many Hiroshima survivors died of cancer at a young age. You were lucky and lived long, but your health was never complete. When your grandchildren were born, you told them about Hiroshima, what happened, how you survived, and how dangerous nuclear weapons were. Hiroshima must never be repeated again, you would say. The world saw that day what it was facing. The atomic bomb isn't just a weapon. It's humanity's tool for destroying itself. Hiroshima was a turning point in human history. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the world entered the nuclear age. That day, the second sun that shone in the sky showed humanity that it now possessed the power to completely destroy itself. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world changed. The Cold War began. The nuclear arms race accelerated, and humanity started living with the constant fear of nuclear war. But Hiroshima was also a warning. As Hibakusha bomb survivors, you went everywhere in the world and testified. You gave the message, never again. You campaigned for the banning of nuclear weapons and worked for peace. Hiroshima's suffering didn't go in vain because the world learned a lesson from that day. Today, Hiroshima is a modern city. 1 million people live there. Children go to school, people work, and life continues. But the Peace Park in the city center reminds everyone. There, a fire burns. The peace flame. This fire will continue burning as long as nuclear weapons exist in the world. When the last nuclear weapon is destroyed, this fire will be extinguished. You are now old. 80 years have passed since Hiroshima, but you remember that morning as if it were yesterday. The white light, the fire, the pain, the death. But at the same time, you also remember the will to survive, human solidarity, and the power of hope. Hiroshima was one of humanity's darkest moments, but it also gave the most powerful lesson. War is destructive. Nuclear weapons are unacceptable, and peace is the only way. As you draw your last breath, you hold your grandchild's hand. Don't forget Hiroshima, you say. Tell the world, may it never happen again. And when you close your eyes, you see that morning one last time. The second sun in the sky, Hiroshima's last normal morning, and the world forever changed.